We'll see what happens this year depending on how the election turns out, because it looks like it could be a very, very close election. What I would like to do now, though, is run through a couple of PowerPoints, just talk about the general way that the political process for the presidential campaign works. And then when we're all done with that, if you have questions, we can talk as long as you'd like to talk about different aspects of our electoral system. First thing I want to talk about was just how we pick our candidates. You may see up there, this is all the list of a picture of all the Republican presidential candidates from early in the race. And some of those people you probably don't even recognize anymore because it's been so long since we talked about them. The fellow on the far right, for example, I had to even go review who he was. It was John Huntsman, who was our ambassador in China, who decided he wanted to be a candidate, and he quickly realized he wasn't going to have much success, and he dropped out of the race very soon. But we have a whole list of people who decide they want to run for president. How do they do that? Well, to secure the Republican nomination for running for the candidacy to be the Republican candidate, you need to have 1,144 delegates out of a total of 2,286 nationwide. And that can be a very exciting process, especially when you have cases where you have two very closely matched candidates, and it goes down to the very end to the national convention as to who has the most candidates, or the delegates. And the question is, how do you get those delegates? Let's go to the next one. There are a number of different ways you get them based on what state you're in. Some states have what they call primary elections. It's just like a regular election, except it's only amongst the people from your particular party. All the Democrats run in one election, all the Republicans run separately, and the state voters get to decide which one of those groups, or which candidate they want for Democrats and Republicans. That's a primary system. And most of the states use primary elections. There are some, though, that use what they call a caucus system, where at the very local level, the neighborhood level, what we call a precinct, the people who live in that precinct, who are registered as either Republicans or Democrats, will meet in somebody's living room, and they all sit down and they talk amongst themselves, and they debate back and forth for a couple hours, and maybe just 20 or 30 people there. It might be just 5 or 10 people there, depending upon the state and the precinct. And that group then votes at the end of the evening on who they want their candidate to be. And they pick a delegate who's going to vote for that particular candidate. That's the caucus system. It's very famous, particularly in Iowa, which is the first state that gets together usually in, I guess, February of the year before the election, a year of the election, to choose their delegates. And they all meet in small towns and people's living rooms, and they choose their delegates that way. Most of the states, though, as I mentioned, use the primary system, where there's just a straight election. And then out of that election, usually on a proportional basis, they decide how many delegates are going to go for each candidate. For example, if Governor Romney won 60% of the vote in that state, he would get 60% of the delegates to go to the convention. And that's the way most of the states work. So this is now the general campaign, the campaign that really starts after September 1st. This is when the candidates are on the road day after day, constantly, 24 hours a day, traveling around the United States, speaking until they usually lose their voice. I heard President Obama the other day, and you could hardly hear him talk because his voice was so hoarse, because he's been doing nothing but campaigning now since really the first part of September. And this is when they also begin to present their vice president. And they're chosen at the convention, but up until then, no one really knows usually who the vice presidential candidate will be. To be honest, very few people in the United States ever vote for a vice president. They vote for the president, and then whoever the vice president is kind of tagging along. Sometimes people will vote against a person because they don't like the vice president, but very rarely do they choose a candidate based on who the vice president is. They're very clearly the number 2 position, and they don't get nearly as much attention. Because of a system which you just saw earlier, where certain states have more electoral votes than others, those states become much more important than other states. In some states, everybody knows in advance if it's going to be a Republican state or a Democratic state. For example, the state of Montana is almost always a Republican state. The state of Mississippi is almost always a Republican state. The state of California is almost always a Democratic state. If the candidates know that, they're not going to waste their time and their money campaigning in those states. So what they do is they zero in on the 7 to 10 states that are could go either way. It could be Republican or it could be Democratic. And they spend all their time and almost all their money in those states because that's what really they need to win. And one other thing I should say, it's not for you, I know it's not as important in some ways, but Americans are not voting just for president. We don't have elections at various times, for as many different seats as some other countries. We do everything on the same day. So on November 6th, we're voting for president, but we're also voting for all of our congressmen and congresswomen. We're voting for 1/3 of our senators, 1/3 every 2 years. We're voting for governors, we're voting for state representatives, state senators, we're voting for county boards of education, we're voting for dog catcher, we're voting for judges, we're voting for all sorts of different things, all on that same day. So if any of you, I don't know if anyone here votes in the U.S., and maybe some American citizens here who've seen absentee ballots, it's a long, long ballot. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 pages because there are so many different things that are being voted upon. Most of the world only thinks about the president. That's just one of many, many elections, and local elections are just as important to many Americans as the presidential election. Who runs your county, who runs your state, who runs your school board is very, very important to everybody. So it's not just the presidential election. So that's basically, in a nutshell, how the election system works. It's very different from many places around the world, especially the electoral college aspect of it. As I said, for many people it's a fairly controversial system, and it becomes controversial whenever we have a very close election. When it's not close, because no one cares. We'll see again what happens this year. The latest polls I've seen indicate that the race is getting closer and closer, and as I mentioned, these 3 or 4 key states like Virginia, Florida, Ohio, and moving westward, maybe Colorado and Nevada are going to have a very important part to play in this. So as you're watching TV, if you're watching on election night or election morning, here maybe it will be, you want to look and see how those states have come out. Because I think once we see what's happening in Florida and in Virginia and Ohio, we'll pretty much, I think, know the outcome of this